So, what can we learn about stress and anxiety from one of the world's most notorious killers? Hello, I'm Chester Elton, not a killer, and this is my co-author and dear friend, Adrian Gostick.
That's right. Chess, 10 times indicted, never convicted. So
Never
that's
convicted.
Awesome. Hey, and we were thrilled to have you here, everybody joining us today on the show. We're going to talk to an expert who conducted extensive interviews with the Son of Sam killer, David Berkowitz. And that might just give us a little deeper glimpse into ourselves and those around us. Very intriguing. As always, we hope the time you spend with us will help reduce the stigma of anxiety at work and in your personal life.
And with us is our new friend, Michael Caparelli, a former pastor of 16 years who has a PhD in advanced studies in human behavior. His work helps people navigate through mental health issues from a faith-based perspective, and his nonprofit organization, Unmuted, helps give victims of trauma their voices back. He is the author of a new book, Monster in the Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz, once known as the Son of Sam. Michael, delighted to have you here. I know this is going to be a really interesting conversation. Thank you for finding the time.
Thank you for having me. The title is actually Monster Mirror, not Monster in the Mirror, just in case the viewer goes to Amazon and looks for it. Monster Mirror actually ranked number 1 on Amazon in the true crime section in October for about 4 or 5 days.
Well, thanks for the correction, Mike. I'm very coachable, so I appreciate that immediate feedback.
Yeah, it's a shame true crime doesn't sell better. I mean, yeah, is there a more popular genre right now? So good for you. Hey, for those who may not be familiar with the Son of Sam, it's been quite a few years now. Tell us Berkowitz's story and really what you learned from meeting with him.
Yeah, so I met with David Berkowitz for 34 sessions, about 3.5 hours a session, a total of 100 hours, the longest analysis ever conducted on David Berkowitz in the 46 years of being behind bars. My meetings began with him in April 2022. And it took me all the way to the fall of 2023 when I finalized the interviews into a book called Monster Mirror. David Berkowitz was a ticking time bomb, probably from the time he was about 6 or 7 years old, a ball of stress. And in fact, his crimes were not only was the result of his own stress and many other factors that I discussed in the book, but he also put the city of New York through a 1.5 years of great stress. He gunned down 13 people. He lit 1,400 fires throughout the Bronx. Interestingly enough, while the NYPD was looking for the Son of Sam, the one who gunned down 13 people, they were also looking for the Phantom of the Bronx, someone who was a serial arsonist lighting buildings on fire. Little did they know that both those people were the same person. And it was a post office worker. He worked in the Bronx, the main office on Grand Course Parkway. And he was a man who just was isolated in his personality, lots of factors that contributed to the stress and the inability to manage stress. And finally, in 1977, he was arrested, detained, and he's been behind bars since his 24th birthday. He's going on 71 years old now.
Wow. What were your biggest learnings in meeting him? You know, we were in New York City as a young, poor couple, you know, and knew of that legend. You know, we lived in Brooklyn. So you had all these sessions. What is it that you really learned from meeting him about stress and maybe about ourselves and our own personal lives?
Well, when you do a case study of this nature, you collect your data and then you conduct what's known as thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is when you're looking for themes to emerge, repetitious subjects, and 9 themes emerged. I call it a recipe for violence, but many of those factors relate directly to stress, probably the biggest factor of all being isolation. David Berkowitz was a very isolated individual, which is not uncommon for your mass shooters. A lot of the school shooters, mall shooters, even serial killers, for that matter, they're outsiders. David Berkowitz called himself an outsider in the very letters that he wrote, taunting the police, letters that he would leave in between bodies at crime scenes. Now, how does that relate to stress? Well, lots of studies have shown that relationship is a buffer for stress. And when you're isolated, cortisol and adrenaline levels go up, oxytocin levels go down. Cortisol and adrenaline equals aggression, oxytocin equals empathy. So the more isolated an individual is, the more aggressive they become and the less empathetic. David Berkowitz is a case in point. I mean, the man was with a lot of people, don't get me wrong. This is New York City, most populated city in the country. But there's a big difference between being with people and bonding with people. David was with people, but he was never really assimilated. He was in the military for 3 years. He had a lot of comrades. Even as a kid, he played on baseball teams, but nonetheless, he remained isolated. Without that buffer for stress, close relationships, people that we can share our stories and our secrets and our struggles, David Berkowitz became a ticking time bomb. University of Japan did a fascinating study on isolation and its relationship with stress. They took a group of rodents, they isolated a sample of rodents from the community. And I want to say about 15 days or so, after isolating those rodents for a period of time, they returned them back to the community. And at the point of reentry, the isolated rodents attacked aggressively the rodents from their community just from being isolated for 15 days. I think we got a whiff of this during 2020. 2020 was a very contentious year. And one could say, well, it was a political year. It was George Floyd. It was race. It was politics. But underneath it all, we were quarantined. We were isolated from each other. And that isolation, it really is a fuel. It's a petroleum for stress. And it was one of the factors. I won't say it was all of the factors, but it was one of the factors in what paved the way for the Son of Sam massacre in 1976 to 1977.
So this is really curious to me because you say isolation, even though he was in this populated city, he had, comrades in the military, he had obviously other postal workers and so on. So was it self-isolation? What caused him to be isolated? Was it his choice? Was he rejected? Can you go a little deeper on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it began in his childhood. I'm a professor of psychology, criminal psychology, abnormal psych. I teach at 3 different colleges, and I teach a lot on, attachment theory, relationship building from the gate, like from the time we're infants. And David's attachment style from a young age, partly to do with his parents and the way he was parented. He was an only child. He was adopted. By the way, serial killers are 16 times more likely to be adopted than the general population. That's not to say if you're adopted, you're going to become a serial killer. But being adopted certainly can affect one's attachment style. So David's attachment style, the way in which he related to the world, was shaped from a young age, and he wasn't properly socialized. Being an only child, attending a school where he was targeted by teachers because he was hyperactive. I mean, think back on the early 1960s, the public school system. The teacher would take his desk, put it in the middle of the class because he was hyperactive, and say, "This is where the bad boys sit." So he never really, from a young age, from early childhood all the way through adolescence, never really learned how to properly bond with people and always felt like on the fringes of whatever group he joined, just didn't know how to bond, didn't know how to, intimacy is really knowing and being known. Very uncomfortable with knowing other people and very uncomfortable with being known. And that put him, on the fringes of any group that he belonged to. Because once again, being with people and bonding with people are not the same thing.
So, the title of our podcast is Anxiety at Work. As an attachment theory expert, as somebody who deals in mental health and different areas, how do you bring some of this that we're learning from somebody as extreme as Berkowitz into workplace? How do we maybe learn some lessons from what you've had on a podcast like this?
Interesting, we're talking workplace because David Berkowitz was a postal worker. You've heard of the saying going postal. A lot of that comes from I believe there was another postal worker prior to David that had also committed a massacre, but David Berkowitz was certainly the more notorious of the two. So that phrase "going postal" it's very often linked with David Berkowitz. Now, I'm not going to argue that the stress of his job caused him to do what he did. I mean, being a postal worker was definitely stressful. He'll tell you that. But certainly his inability to relate to people around him, and in particular in the workplace, not knowing how to establish relationships. Now, if you're that person listening to this broadcast and you're saying, well, how do I build relationships? I'm that guy that feels alone, even in a group of people. Because if you're that person that feels alone, you feel isolated, even at the party or even in the work environment where maybe there's 30 people around you. Um, David Berkowitz's story is certainly relevant for you. I'd recommend getting the book Monster Mare on Amazon. But one of the first steps is finding common ground with other people. I mean, you got to put yourself out there. It requires a level of vulnerability. But C.S. Lewis, a classic author of the 20th century, he said relationship begins the moment when one person looks at another person and says, "You too? I thought I was the only one." So that common ground, that connection, is really essential to relationship. Because let's face it, if you're spending time with someone, even if it's all day long, but there's no establishing of common ground, there's no connection, then you and I really don't get what we need from the relationship. And the relationship doesn't serve as the buffer for stress that I believe it has the potential of serving.
Are there people who are more susceptible to stress and being overwhelmed by stress than others?
Yeah, in the case of David Berkowitz, I go all the way back to his time in the womb. That might sound crazy,
Really?
but yeah, well, the 9 months in the womb is a time we think learning begins in the classroom. It doesn't, it begins in the womb. In fact, the learning in the womb is probably the most profound because it's not cognitive, it's visceral, it's the central nervous system. In the pregnancy that David, when his mom was pregnant with him, it was a very tumultuous pregnancy. She often engaged in fistfights with his father. His father wanted her to give him up for adoption. She wanted to keep him. They had these altercations. And interestingly enough, from the time David was born, he was a very finicky, temperamental baby, hard to handle. Like his adopted parents took him home and they said he was very difficult to coddle, very difficult to calm down. Now, there's a lot of studies being done currently on what's known as prenatal programming or prenatal development. In fact, babies, or should I say fetuses, personally, I believe a fetus is a euphemism for a baby. I believe life begins in the womb. But a baby in the womb or a fetus in the womb, depending upon how you see it, uh, during 9/11, those moms that were carrying babies that were living in lower Manhattan, well, studies have been done on those moms that were there during 9/11, the days after the towers were hit. And if you remember that time period, you guys are probably around my age or maybe a little older. I'm in my late 40s. You know that it was a stressful time for New York City. And those babies showed in a study at a follow up point or about 2 or 3 years later, they showed all the markers, the genetic markers for PTSD, simply by being in the womb of a mom that was going through a stressful time living in lower Manhattan during post 9/11. So prenatal programming, what happens during those 9 months when a baby is in the womb? I'm only targeting one factor. We could get into genetics that goes back
Mhm.
generations. There definitely are particular genes, clusters of genes that can make one more susceptible to stress. But that prenatal time is a big one. I can tell you, as a father of 4 kids, my daughter, who's the most easygoing, their mom or that daughter's mother had a very easygoing pregnancy. And the daughter who's a deep feeler, she feels things very profoundly. She can be a little too quick to react. Mom's pregnancy with her was a very tumultuous pregnancy. So prenatal program is something that we're learning more and more about right now, and more funds are being devoted to that particular area of study.
Wow. Hey, we're going to get to, in just a moment, Michael, we're going to get to sort of growing up and so social dynamics. But how do people learn more about your work? Where would you send them?
You can go to a few places. You can find me on Facebook. Just type in Mike Caparelli, Caparelli. I put up teachings on mental health from a faith based perspective every day on Facebook. I've got close to 8,000 followers. You can go to my website, unmuted.app, APP. Or you can go on Amazon and buy any one of my 5 books. They're all dealing with mental health from a faith based perspective. Most recently, Monster Mera, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz. I've got another book called Pen Your Pain in the Parables. It's on recovering from post traumatic stress through a writing exercise, also known as narrative therapy. But yeah, you can find me on Facebook, unmuted.app, or you can go to Amazon or Barnes and Noble to order any of my books.
Awesome. Good. So let's get, and maybe even drop in some ideas on faith based and how this plays in. But you've studied social dynamics then as we've grown up. Okay, so we leave the womb. Now we're social dynamics and development. You talked about how Berkowitz wasn't connecting with people very well. So how does the way we grew up influence? Then we come into the workplace, how we interact with others in the workplace. Help us make that connection.
Well,
Yeah.
those early childhood experiences, we can put them in 2 categories: uh, crystallizing experiences or paralyzing experiences. A crystallizing experience is a positive experience. It sort of crystallizes this idea that relationships are good or that school education is good. Paralyzing experiences, they induce fear, stress, shame. Shame is another big one. David had many paralyzing experiences during his childhood, perhaps more paralyzing than crystallizing, and they certainly paved the way for the inability to cope with life stress factors as he grew up. I mean, he couldn't deal with sounds, for instance, his neighbor's barking dog. He couldn't deal with the demands of everyday life, like paying bills. The lack of coping skills by the time he reached his 20s was definitely, and I'm not making excuses by no means. I mean, the man is serving his time. He doesn't expect to get out. I would never advocate for him to get out, but I am trying to bring some explanation to how this can happen because the facts are there are 13 mass shootings a week in the United States. And many of these people that are committing these crimes, they lack the proper coping skills in handling stress. And it goes back to some of those paralyzing experiences of early childhood, shame being a big factor, because David had many shameful experiences in the schoolyard, in the classroom, at home. And if you know what it's like to be ashamed, I mean, your stress levels go up very high. There's certainly a strong correlation between shame and stress.
Yeah. You're right. Shame is such a powerful emotion, isn't it?
Mm.
I'm curious, Mike. We're always interested in self-care tactics of successful people and in your practice and the books you've written and so on. And especially with your time with Berkowitz, what are some of the things that you do? What are some personal practices you use to keep yourself, you know, I'm not going to say stress free, no one ever is. What are some of your personal practices to keep yourself mentally in a good place?
Well, number one, I'm a man of faith.
Right.
So I believe in a higher power, so when life is stressful and I can't handle the problems of the day and I'm laying in bed about to go to sleep, I look up at God and I say, God, you're up all night. No need for two of us. No need for two of us to stay awake. This is not my problem. It's yours. You're the giver of life. So I'm going to go to sleep. And why don't you think about this all night? So I have a God that I can do that with on a regular basis, that I can let go and let God, that I can give it over to Him. So that's first and foremost. Secondly, I'm a man of routine. And David Berkowitz, by the way, has become a man of routine. I mean, his trajectory of growth is pretty tremendous. Being a man of routine, I don't go with the whims of the moment. I wake up, at usually the same time every day around 5 o'clock. I pray, I exercise, I read my morning scriptures. So that routine, it keeps me from feeling aimless. Thirdly, I'm a man who meditates. I believe in the practice of meditation. I believe that your mind, your thoughts, is something you've got to capture. You've got to take control of it before it takes control of you. And meditation helps me do that. It also helps me to accept life on life's terms. I'm also a man of community and relationships. I have a group of friends I meet with on a regular basis, and I process my problems through with those people. I don't believe you can process problems alone. I'm also a man who writes. I believe in the power of journaling, processing through my thoughts on paper. Writing helps me to refine my thoughts. It's also a cathartic release. I discuss that in my book, Pen Your Pain in the Parables. Oh, so between faith, routine, community, meditation, and writing exercises, I mean, that keeps me grounded and keeps me in a place of homeostasis when life gets very stressful.
We're about to wrap up here, Mike, and thank you for sharing those practices. A lot of those things are things that I do as well, and I'm a big fan of routine. If you're starting to feel a little off kilter, go to your routine, go to your your daily practices. I am curious though, how is Berkowitz doing now? I mean, you mentioned before we came on to the podcast that you've actually developed a bit of a friendship with him. So after all these years and being incarcerated, not expecting to get out, in your view, as a man of faith and one of his friends and confidants, how's he doing?
I tell you, he's the most productive guy I know, which is strange because he's behind bars. You'd think, 46 years, he'd be a loafer. Lifers are loafers usually. They get institutionalized and they feel helpless. Not David Berkowitz. He wakes up every day. He was for a long time a mobile assistant, takes people in wheelchairs to the infirmary to get their medication. He writes to people on a regular basis. I mean, he's got a long, line of mail that he gets from people from around the world, suicidal teenagers. He's even had other serial killers write him. For instance, the campus killer from a couple of years ago that killed 4 in, I believe, Utah, wrote David a letter. People write to David because they figure he's a place to turn to where they won't be judged. There's no stones to throw. And he's very gracious. He's very compassionate towards those that struggle. He sees that as a ministry. He sees it as a personal assignment from heaven. I believe David Berkowitz is in many ways transformed and reformed. I would never argue for him to be released. I think he's doing as good as a man can do behind bars, and he probably should stay there. But I'd say he's definitely taken, his time behind bars and has done his best to redeem his life from being a disaster to something more fruitful.
Interesting. So, Mike, fascinating conversation. Appreciate your insights. For our listeners on the podcast, if there were one or two things that you wanted them to take away from the story of David Berkowitz and how they can relate to the workplace and their lives, one or two things, what would that be?
I would say, number one, you need a friend. You cannot handle life alone. Isolation can be very tempting, especially in our culture where you're constantly hearing about self. There's a great deal of focus on self care. Self seems to be self-ease on Facebook. Self seems to be the big theme. That's fine, but when it's self at the expense of others and community, you're in trouble. In fact, the data shows that self-consciousness and neurotic emotion both show up at the same time on an fMRI. We don't do well when we're just thinking about ourselves. We get neurotic. We need other people. We need relationship. We need community. So if your self-care means pulling away from people, you're in trouble. That's the first point. The second point I would say is, looking at my own life and David's life, I believe we need a faith in a God, a higher power, something bigger than ourselves. Because if we're left to our own devices, without a God to call upon, a savior, when we're in trouble, looking at our own resources can be very discouraging. We need to know that someone else is looking out for us.
It's so interesting. Both those things to me speak of community, right? a community that you've got here, and then a faith-based community. Really appreciate your time, Mike. Congratulations on the wonderful success of your book. If you're looking for a great book to help you not only understand one of the great crime, novels and situations, the book is wait a minute. The book is Monster Mirror, not Monster in the Mirror. It's Monster Mirror, 100 Hours with David Berkowitz, once known as the Son of Sam. Mike, I appreciate the work you're doing, your ministry, the way you reach out to people, and your time with us on the podcast today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you, my friend.
So, Adrian, one of our most interesting guests, without question, the guy who had 100 hours with the Son of Sam. What were some of your takeaways?
First off, yesterday or the day before when I started thinking about this, I was like, well, we're having the Son of Sam interviewer on our show about anxiety at work, but it worked because first off, there's so much to learn in here. What creates somebody who does as horrific things as Berkowitz did? Of course, again, starting in the womb, but just that importance of bonding with people and not just fly by night. How you doing? Oh, fine. It's those close relationships we talk about in anxiety at work that are so important, that we feel like sometimes I'm going to be isolated to help with my mental health. And you've said that's the worst thing you could possibly do.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. When he said there's a difference between being and bonding, that really struck me as, are you really developing deep and meaningful relationships, whether it's at work or in your personal life. And this idea too, that isolation is such a big issue in driving stress and driving us. And he makes the point that the pandemic, that of all the things that happened, that was probably the most detrimental. And, we talked to lots of people. I remember we had a story of a grandma who had to isolate. She had a fragile health and no one could come see her. And she said, I haven't had a hug in a year and a half. Yeah. And how devastating that is when you're disconnected. You're being, but you're not bonding, was one of my big takeaways.
Yeah, it's so poignant, and that's why we started this podcast, was in the pandemic to give people a little bit of hope and how to deal with things. I love that, the idea kind of coming back to more relationships, that idea of relationships begin when you say, oh, you too? That's powerful.
Yeah.
When we create and you seek for them. Sometimes you're not going to create a connection with a person. That's fine. But often you will. I was just in the doctor this morning, and the eye doctor, and we started connecting. All of a sudden, he'd been in England for a while, and I had been in England, and we started creating a connection. You look for those things if you, as he says, put yourself out there. So if you feel yourself alone at work or whatever group you're in, it's time to kind of break out of our comfort zone.
Yeah, the other thing that he talked about was in your childhood, the crystallizing moments and the paralyzing moments, and that shame was such a driver of stress and anxiety and pulling back. It really struck me that we are in a society that's very unforgiving right now. Whether it's the online bullying or the divide that we seem to have in any kind of political discussion, this idea of shaming is something we've really got to do a better job dealing with. And as parents, it's very easy to shame our kids and to get them to do something. And that to me really stuck out, that the fear and stress and shame was a big driver of anxiety and then caused all these other problems down the road.
Yeah. We don't realize how much sometimes we can be affecting, people around us, our loved ones, people at work. And so instead of shame, what about, hey, what can we learn next time? How can we do things, and what can we learn and move forward? As our friend Marshall Goldsmith says, it's not feedback, it's feed forward. How do we keep our eyes pointed ahead? Right. So I love that. What a great, interesting podcast. Very different for us. And we really want to thank Mike Caprelli for coming on. We want to thank our producer, Brent Klein, for putting this all together, to Christy Lawrence, who helps us find amazing guests, and to all of you who listened in. If you like the podcast, share it, tell your friends about it. We'd also love you to visit thecultureworks.com for free resources, including chapters of books that are free, all the news about our new book, The Gratitude Habit and 90-Day Journal. Great stuff on there, isn't there, Chess?
Absolutely. And we love speaking, whether it's virtual or in person. We'd love to speak to your organization about teamwork, resilience, culture, and of course, gratitude. And we also have our Anxiety at Work book that we would encourage you to pick up. It's also available on litvideobook.com. It's a video book. It's a 29-minute video book. We're very excited about this new format for learning. Well, Adrian, always great to be with you. Always great to have these interesting guests. And we would encourage you, if you like the podcast, please really do share it with others. We're hoping that we'll be able to reduce, that shame and anxiety in the workplace. Adrian, I'll give you the final word. Wrap us up.
Well, just want a big thanks to Chester. He's on the road. He's in a hotel room in St. Louis, and but believes so much in this. This is our passion project. We do this out of our own pocket. We do this because we really want to give back and make sure that people feel like they have a resource to deal with anxiety they're dealing with in their work. So until next time, we wish you the best of mental health.
And that's a wrap.